4 people were murdered in a locked cabin and the killer seemed to disappear. At first, the cabin looked like an ordinary vacation home in the quiet mountain community of Keddie, California. But inside cabin 28, something unimaginable had happened. 4 people were dead. The victims had been attacked inside the cabin during the night, and the crime scene suggested a terrifying struggle. Yet when investigators began examining the evidence, one question became impossible to ignore. How could someone commit such a brutal crime inside a cabin and seemingly vanish without leaving a clear trail? The case would become one of California's most disturbing unsolved murders. And decades later, the question of who killed the family remains haunting. It was April 12, 1981. Keddie was a small resort community in Plumas County, surrounded by forests and mountains. It was the kind of place where people expected quiet nights, familiar neighbors, and relatively little trouble. Cabin 28 was occupied by the Sharp family. Inside were 36-year-old Glenna Sue Sharp, her children John, age 15, and Tina, age 12, along with John's friend Dana Wingate, age 17, who had been staying at the cabin. That night, however, something went terribly wrong. By the morning of April 12, the cabin had become a crime scene. Sue Sharp, John Sharp, and Dana Wingate had been murdered. Tina Sharp was missing. The disappearance of Tina transformed an already horrifying murder into something even more mysterious. Where was she? Had she witnessed what happened? Had someone taken her? And most frightening of all, was the killer still somewhere nearby? The murders were discovered when members of the Sharp family realized something was wrong. Inside cabin 28, investigators found a disturbing scene. 3 victims had been killed in the living room area. The crime scene indicated that the victims had been restrained and attacked. There were signs of violence throughout the room, but investigators also noticed something strange. The cabin did not immediately look like the work of a stranger who had simply broken in, attacked everyone, and fled. There were details that suggested the killer or killers may have known the victims. The investigation quickly became complicated. The victims had been attacked at close range. Yet there was no obvious explanation for how the murderer had entered and escaped without immediately attracting attention. And Tina was nowhere to be found. 12-year-old Tina Sharp became the center of the investigation. Her absence created an enormous mystery. If she had been inside the cabin when the murders occurred, she could potentially have been a witness. But investigators could not determine what had happened to her. Was Tina kidnapped? Had she escaped? Was she taken away before the murders? Or had she been killed somewhere else? For years, the mystery surrounding Tina's disappearance would overshadow nearly every other aspect of the case. The search expanded beyond Keddie. Authorities searched surrounding areas and followed leads that took them far beyond the small mountain community. But Tina remained missing. The family was left without answers. And the case slowly began to grow cold. Investigators faced another major problem. The cabin contained evidence, but the evidence did not immediately reveal a clear identity. The killer appeared to have left behind clues, but there was no simple answer connecting those clues to one specific person. The crime also raised questions about motive. Why would someone attack Sue Sharp and the others? Was the murder planned? Was it personal? Was the killer looking for someone? Or did something happen inside the cabin that escalated into murder? The more investigators examined the case, the more questions emerged. There was another disturbing possibility. Perhaps the killer knew the layout of the cabin. Perhaps the killer knew who was inside. Perhaps the victims trusted the person who entered. If that were true, the murderer may not have needed to force their way inside. And that possibility made the case even more frightening. Detectives began interviewing residents, friends, relatives, and people who had connections to the victims. They examined the Sharp family's relationships. They looked at disputes. They considered people who had visited the cabin. They investigated possible suspects. But despite the investigation, authorities could not immediately identify the killer. The case received attention because of the brutality of the murders and the disappearance of Tina. Yet as time passed without an arrest, the investigation became increasingly difficult. Witness memories faded. Evidence became harder to interpret. And the person responsible remained free. For the Sharp family, the absence of answers was devastating. They knew 3 members of their family had been murdered. But they did not know what had happened to Tina. The years passed. The Keddie murders became one of those cases that investigators and amateur detectives continued to revisit. People developed theories. Some believed the murderer was someone who knew the family. Others believed more than one person may have been involved. Some theories focused on individuals connected to Keddie. Others suggested that the truth had been overlooked because the investigation happened before modern forensic technology existed. But theories were not enough. What investigators needed was evidence. And for years, the evidence seemed frustratingly incomplete. Then, decades after the murders, the case suddenly received new attention. Investigators revisited evidence from the original crime scene. Advances in forensic technology offered opportunities that investigators in 1981 simply did not have. Old evidence could be examined again. Previously overlooked information could be reconsidered. And investigators began looking at the case with fresh eyes. The possibility emerged that modern forensic testing might finally reveal information about who had been inside the cabin. The investigation was no longer simply a cold case buried in history. It was alive again. One of the most intriguing developments involved the hammer that was discovered years after the murders. The hammer was reportedly found near a home connected to the case. Its significance became a major point of interest for investigators. Could it have been connected to the murders? Could modern testing identify biological material or fingerprints? Could it finally connect a suspect to the cabin? The possibility was enormous. But forensic testing does not automatically solve a case. Evidence must be interpreted carefully. Investigators must establish where an object came from, how it was handled, and whether its connection to the crime can be proven beyond reasonable doubt. Still, the discovery renewed public interest. People who had followed the Keddie murders for decades began wondering whether the case might finally have an ending. But there was still one question that remained painfully unanswered. Where was Tina Sharp? For decades, her disappearance remained one of the most mysterious parts of the case. Her family continued to hope for answers. Investigators continued to search. And then, in 2011, an important development occurred. Human remains discovered in Texas were eventually identified as Tina Sharp. The discovery finally answered one question. Tina had not simply disappeared. She had been killed. But the discovery created another devastating question. Who took her from California to Texas? And was her disappearance directly connected to the murders inside Cabin 28? Investigators now knew that Tina's story had continued far beyond Keddie. But the person responsible remained elusive. As investigators reopened the case, attention eventually focused on individuals who had connections to the Sharp family and the Keddie area. One name that became associated with the investigation was Martin Smart, a resident of Keddie who lived near the Sharp family. Smart had previously been investigated in connection with the case. His name became significant because of his proximity to the crime and his relationship with people connected to the victims. Another individual, John Boubade, was also considered by investigators. The possibility that more than one person was involved became an important theory. But suspicion is not the same as proof. Despite years of investigation, no one was convicted of the Keddie murders. And without a conviction, the central mystery remained. The physical location of the murders is part of what makes this case so disturbing. Cabin 28 was not a busy city apartment. It was a small cabin in an isolated mountain community. The surrounding environment could provide privacy, someone could potentially approach without being noticed, and after the murders, someone could leave and disappear into the surrounding area. But investigators still had to answer the biggest question. How did the killer or killers leave without being caught? The remoteness of Keddie may have provided exactly the opportunity someone needed. Yet the same isolation that could help a murderer escape could also have made it easier for investigators to identify suspicious movements. That did not happen. At least, not conclusively. The Keddie Cabin Murders have remained a haunting example of how a crime can survive for generations without a definitive resolution. The murders happened in 1981. Decades later, people were still discussing them. New technology brought new hope. Old evidence was reconsidered. Suspects were re-examined. And Tina's remains were finally identified. But identifying a victim is not the same as identifying the person responsible. The Sharp family received part of the truth. They learned what had happened to Tina. But the full story remained hidden. Imagine the final moments inside cabin 28. The family is inside. The night is quiet. Then something changes. A confrontation begins. Fear spreads through the cabin. The victims are restrained. The attack becomes deadly. And somehow, after the violence, the person responsible leaves. No dramatic getaway. No confirmed eyewitness. No immediate arrest. Just an empty cabin containing evidence of a terrible crime. And somewhere beyond that cabin, a killer disappears into the darkness. That is what makes the case so unsettling. It isn't simply that the murders happened. It is that someone appears to have known how to commit them and escape. More than 4 decades later, investigators and true crime researchers continue to examine the case. Was there one killer? Were there multiple killers? Did the murderer know the Sharp family? Was Tina taken before or after the other murders? Why was she transported hundreds of miles away? And perhaps the most important question: who was responsible for the deaths inside cabin 28? The answers may still exist somewhere in the evidence. Perhaps they are hidden in a forgotten document. Perhaps someone who knows the truth is still alive. Perhaps a piece of forensic evidence has not yet revealed everything it contains. Or perhaps the person responsible died without ever confessing. The Keddie murders remain one of California's most haunting cold cases. For the victims, this is not simply a mystery. Sue Sharp was a mother. John Sharp was a teenager. Dana Wingate was a young man whose life was cut short. And Tina Sharp was a 12-year-old girl whose disappearance became a mystery that lasted for decades. Their lives were more than the crime that ended them, but the unanswered questions surrounding their deaths continue to haunt investigators and the public. The cabin itself became infamous. A place that should have represented shelter became the setting for a nightmare. And even after the passage of decades, the central question remains: who walked into cabin 28 that night, and why did they leave without being caught? The case reminds us that time does not always erase a crime. Sometimes, it only makes the mystery deeper. And sometimes, the truth waits quietly inside evidence that nobody knows how to read yet. The Keddie Cabin Murders remain a chilling reminder that even in a quiet mountain community, darkness can arrive without warning, and when it leaves, it may take the truth with it. 4 people were murdered. 1 family was shattered. 1 victim disappeared for decades. And the person responsible has never stood trial for the crime. If you enjoyed this investigation and want more gripping true crime stories, subscribe to the channel, turn on notifications, and stay with us as we uncover the cases that still have questions left unanswered. Because sometimes, the most frightening mysteries aren't the ones without clues. They're the ones where the clues are still waiting to tell us what really happened.